Well, here in the early years of the 1900s, there are fewer and fewer friends in our society who remember the history of the Underground Railroad that operated here in our county in Guilford. But I have here the reflections of Addison Coffin, whose father, Vestal, was active in that project and whose memory in the latter part of the 1800s is copied here on these pages. Now, as to the Underground Railroad, it is with some hesitation that I venture to speak of its origin and management in North Carolina. As has been mentioned, there were societies formed through the state to protect the freed slaves. Those societies became known by all the freedmen and many slaves. Guilford County became headquarters about 1820 from the result of a long and exciting suit at law to recover a kidnapped man from Delaware State. A colored man named Benjamin Benson was kidnapped from Delaware in 1818, brought to Guilford County and sold to a wealthy slaveholder. In a few weeks, he succeeded in getting word to my father, Vestal Coffin, and pleading for help. The facts in the case were learned. Correspondence was opened with men in Delaware. The kidnapping was proved. My father, Dr. George Swaim, and Enoch Macy were appointed commissioners to represent Benjamin Benson by the state of Delaware to recover his freedom. A warrant was procured to arrest Mr. T and require him to show cause why Benson should not have his freedom. The officer entrusted with the warrant suffered word to be sent to Mr. T, notifying him of what was coming. Benson was immediately concealed and that night sent toward Georgia, where he was finally sold. When the trial came off, Mr. T denied that he had such a man, and the warrant was dismissed. The result created much excitement. It was the first open act of the slave spirit to override law and justice. The three commissioners had Nantucket blood in them and were not to be overawed or frightened. In time, they had ample evidence that Mr. T had Benson in his possession the day he was arrested, and he was ordered to produce Benson in open court. This fell like a bombshell among the slaveholders. It cost Mr. T $160 to get Benson. The man to whom he was sold, learning the situation, had his own price and had to be paid at once. When the day of delivery came, there were hundreds of men in and around the courthouse to see and hear the result. The court decreed that Benjamin Benson should have his freedom, and the first conflict between freedom and slavery was ended. Many unthinking and reckless slaveholders indulged in threats and insults, which added to the excitement, which might have ended in trouble, but for the greater and higher excitement of the Missouri Compromise, which sent thousands of non-slaveholders to the Northwest. Again, when friends freed their slaves in 1774, many others promised their slaves freedom when they died, but heirs refused to let them go. Then the societies for freedmen were appealed to, who in many cases succeeded in securing their freedom. Many ran away and got to Pennsylvania and New England. It was while assisting this class in escaping that the idea of organized work suggested itself to the anti-slavery men. In a few years, there was a regular route to Pennsylvania across Virginia, and one to Ohio by way of the Great Virginia Turnpike from Richmond to the Ohio River at the mouth of the Kanawha. This was where and how the Underground Railroad started, and by 1830 was in good working order. From the state lines in Pennsylvania and from the Ohio River in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, regular stations were established at the houses of anti-slavery men at intervals of 20 to 30 miles. Sometimes a forced march of 40 miles had to be made, or hide in the woods or big cornfields. The greatest difficulty to overcome was in getting to the Ohio River, as in time the slave owners became vigilant, both for self-protection and for the reward for capturing fugitives, and it took some strategy to out-general their patrols. The wonder now is that the secret was not discovered in the time intervening between 1830 and 1860, and yet so simple that a child could understand. Literally so plain that had the traveling been done by day, he that ran might read the unerring guides. From the starting point in North Carolina to the great turnpike in Virginia, the Underground Railroad was built, constructed, or marked, as we may call it, by driving nails in trees, fences, and stumps. Where there was a fork in the road, there was a nail driven in the tree 3.5 feet from the ground, halfway round from front to back. If the right-hand road was to be taken, the nail was driven on the right-hand side. If the left was the road, the nail was to the left. If there were fences and no tree, the nail was driven in the middle of the second rail from the top, over on the inside of the fence to the right, or left, as in the trees, if neither tree nor fence was nearer than the stake, or a stone was so set as to be unseen by day, but found at night. When a fugitive started on the road, they were instructed into the mystery. When they came to a fork in the road, they would go to the nearest tree, put their arms around and rub downwards. Whichever arm struck the nail, right or left, that was the road, and they walked right on with no mistake. So with fences, but the stakes, or stones, had to be found with their feet, which was tolerably easily done. Those who were doubtful as to their ability to remember details would take a string and tie short pieces of string to the long one to represent the fork and crossroads, and then by tying notes which they understood, make a complete but simple way, bills that was almost unerring in its simplicity. The most important position on this road was the conductor, whose duty was to keep the road marked, and when necessary, change and relocate as emergencies required. This required a good memory of locality and engineering ability. This system of marking was the same from East Tennessee across Kentucky. In eastern North Carolina, where water transportation was used, they had secret channels and byways marked in a similar way by different means, known alone to their boatmen. The secret of the way marks was known to few, even of the directors. This was absolutely necessary that none might be imperiled by chance treachery. But the conductors, who in many places and in many cases took his life in his hands when he undertook the dangerous charge. There were more fugitives sent back to their homes and masters than were sent away. When one presented himself for passage, he was carefully examined as to ability to run the gauntlet. If found wanting, was sent back. Under no circumstance was the secret of the way marks imparted to anyone except to those who were sent through, and this the last thing done, and then under solemn promise not to divulge it to any living creature, which was always kept. Nor did any one of the anti-slavery men ever solicit or persuade slaves to leave their masters, for there were others who did that, who were actuated by entirely different motives. Their motto, "As ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so to them," was the promoting motive. The members of the freedmen's societies were all friends, and they were in the majority in the manumission societies, or almost all friends, who were Underground Railroad men in North Carolina. But in Tennessee, they were in the minority. It was a rare thing for the conductor in North Carolina to go with fugitives, unless there were women and children in the company. Then they were seen well on the way. The conductor being a friend, no arrangement was made, or thought of, for fighting or defense in case of pursuit. Strategy, swiftness of foot, and adroit maneuvering was the means of safety, though it was said that sometimes some of the patrollers looked very much like they had collided with something physical and demoralizing when they returned from an unsuccessful pursuit. But the whole thing depended on the thorough knowledge of the country, of all its hills, streams, forests, and hiding places, places where they could play Bo Peep with impunity with horsemen. Old veteran conductors were often surprised to see what new light would come into the seeming dull and heavy eyes, and what wonderful agility would develop in the stolid forms of fugitives when aroused by danger. ability to think, to act, to plan unknown to them before was suddenly called into action, which was to them the dawning of a new life. It was the beginning of their real life, nor was such development lost on the conductor. It gave him new knowledge of humanity, more ability to discern the hidden might that lay in undeveloped minds, and made them mind readers. As a part of the secret of the escape of fugitives was the mode of crossing streams and rivers. This was no small item in the plan, for all the ferries were closely watched to prevent fugitives from stealing boats from the landings. Like the other secrets, the crossing of water was simple and safe. It was thus the fugitive was instructed to make a raft of 4 to 6 common fence rails, tied together with a grapevine rope, cord, or grass rope at each end. Then launch the raft, get astride of it, and paddled across with the hands. Then on landing on the opposite bank, always cut the cord, rope, grapevine, and let the rails float downstream, lest someone should see the floating raft and learn the secret. Strange to say, this secret, simple thing, was never discovered. When rails were seen floating downstream, it was always supposed that it was mischievous boys had done it for pure wantonness. The north shore of the Ohio River opposite Point Pleasant was very favorable for this business. It was a sloping, gravelly beach for many miles. Landing could be made at any point, and the long curve enabled the fugitives to see steamboats for miles up or down and escape being seen while crossing. There was no danger of a fugitive failing to cross the Ohio safely. If he reached it safely, his wits were sufficiently sharpened, and his experience such that he would cross Jordan or die. When a fugitive had a wife and children, he would sit astride in front, the largest child next to him, and so next in size, and the wife behind, holding the smaller one and guarding them all. Think of this, young Americans. Think that this condition of things exists within the lifetime of men still living. Coupled with the extreme personal danger, the strain on brain and nerve was so great that few conductors could stand it more than 10 years without rest. And for that rest, they usually went west and took service on the lines in the free states, where it seemed mere child's play compared with the South. In connection with this part of the subject, it is proper here to give a word of explanation why men engaged in so dangerous business without pay, without honor, or any kind of reward from men. First, they felt a divine impulse in their hearts that it was right in the sight of God, and that was enough. Besides, they saw and fully realized that slavery was dragging the master and his children down to the level of the slave, faster than the slave was being lifted up to the level of the master. They even then understood that moral, like physical gravitation, if left free to act, would bring everything to a level. So if the non-slave owners continued to immigrate, it would only be a matter of time when they came to be a level. But there was still another motive. It was to keep alive and intensify the agitation of the subject of slavery, to compel the indifferent to think, for a thinking community nearly always gets to thinking right on any subject. It is impossible for this generation to understand the feelings of the few surviving conductors when they meet and live over their days of peril and danger, and the calm, sweet joy with which they look for their reward in the life to come. In connection with the cause of the immigration from Carolina, it may be well to give the history of that immigration, but it must be borne in mind that there were thousands of other non-slaveholders who were just as strongly opposed to slavery as Quakers, who immigrated at the same time, in the same companies, went with and settled among them in the Northwest, and were co-workers in all their efforts to build up the new country, and were always a unit on the anti-slavery question. Consequently, they will be included in the history. In 1891, before I had any thought of undertaking this work, the editor of the Guilford College requested me to write a series of articles on this subject, which was done, and I shall copy them here with slight changes to suit the connection, as to give the history independent of the original causes.